Rufus Shinra, the Jeff Bezos of Final Fantasy VII, a man full of intense ambition, righteousness, and confidence, whose goal is to rule the world with fear, and he will lead this world through fear, which he will drag kicking and screaming into its new era, the era of the Promised Land. Rufus Shinra is one of the most powerful men in Final Fantasy VII, not due to his physical prowess, although he is known for dueling Cloud on occasion, more so in the remakes, which in itself is a pretty high accolade, but Rufus commands vast legions and vast resources. Rufus has one of the most powerful information networks in all of Gaia. He controls a secret service known as the Turks, are loyal to him and him alone. He also created the terrorist group known as Avalanche, and Rufus has access to the only tailor in all of Midgar who knows how to make wedding dress style suits, and all this and more is given to Rufus as he is president of Shinra, the most powerful company in all of Gaia. If gil, resources, arrogance, and nepotism are power, Rufus has power in spades. Alright, so why am I talking about Rufus? Well, I've talked about the expanded roles I think Sephiroth and Jenova will play in the remakes, what I think Cloud is doing. I've briefly touched on what I think Aerith and Zack are up to, but I feel like Rufus gets somewhat overlooked, even though he is one of the characters with the most expansion from the original game, and most of his characterization actually comes from other sources of media, not the original game. So the main things I want to talk about here are how other sources of media have given Rufus way more characterization, and how they're going to start tying these events and elements into the remake games, with the new character Glenn being the driving force behind them. How they have strangely retconned Rufus's birthday, which I feel has some interesting implications behind it, and my thoughts on how in the original he takes his character pivot from head of Shinra trying to rule the world with fear to all of a sudden becoming a humanitarian later in life and working to save the planet. Now usually I try to avoid doing this, but before we get into the tinfoil hat pieces, I'm going to give a brief history on Rufus. So if you know all of it, including the On a Way to a Smile episode Shinra pieces and the Before Crisis events, then skip ahead and make the turn into Crazy Town, or stay, get refreshed, and correct me where I might be off. It's your unknown journey after all. So what does Rufus do in the original game? In the original game, you actually only fight Rufus once, in the rooftop fight between him and Cloud, after Sephiroth kills Rufus's father, leading to Rufus becoming president of Shinra. From here, we don't see much of him until his inauguration ceremony. Now in the original, there was no meeting with Glenn talking about Wu Tai, there was no assassination attempt from Yuffie, and there was no firing the Junon cannon, which breaks the ceasefire with Wu Tai. Rebirth created all of these as new elements, and we will talk about the value of these Wu Tai events later on, and what they could mean. Next, in the original, after his inauguration ceremony, Rufus then goes to Rocket Town to try to take Cid's tiny Bronco along with Palmer. Using the tiny Bronco, they plan to fly to the city of the Ancients. Now, none of this happened in Rebirth, as they just took a helicopter to the temple along with Hojo to witness the events, and Cid very much still has his plane. We see Cloud and company fly off in it in the end of Rebirth. This is where Rebirth ends, and I would imagine the third game with Rocket Town and Cid will be further expanded on and changed in different ways. Now, from here in the original, again, we don't see Rufus much until the events of Northern Crater, where they yap a lot about reunion theory with Hojo and the Promised Land. Now once Cloud gives Sephiroth the black materia, a torrent of chaos starts to happen, which causes the weapons to awaken, and in this chaos, Rufus is able to ultimately capture Tifa, Barret, Yuffie, and Cetras, and he plans to execute them publicly in Junon. The crew escapes Junon, thanks to Sapphire Weapon attacking the port town, harbor, fishing village, city, Grand Duchy, whatever jurisdiction Junon is considered. This weapon attack on Junon leads Rufus to having a meeting with his Shinra board to assess the current situation at hand. Him and his board talk about ways to destroy the impending meteor from Sephiroth, break the barrier around him, protecting Northern Crater, and the weapons that are attacking cities, as another one of these weapons are now descending onto their HQ at Midgar. So what is the genius plan this Shinra board of directors comes up with?
My gun! Oh. Anyway, I started blasting. Bang!
They make a giant super weapon, moving the cannon from Junon to Midgar and upgrading the cannon with the power of huge materia to kill the weapon attacking the city, break the Northern Crater barrier, and hopefully kill Sephiroth in the process, all in one big powerful shot. A special beam cannon, if you will. Now, while the cannon actually does do most of these things in one shot, Hojo, wanting to experiment, upgrades the special beam cannon instead of killing Sephiroth to power him up instead. Damn you, Hojo, the betrayal. Now, I've talked about this briefly before, but in the remakes, when this cannon powers up Sephiroth, I think instead of just being a bunch of Mako dumped into him, I think we're going to see the Omega materia from Dirge of Cerberus come into play with the power-up, but I don't want to get too into the weeds with that here. What is important here, though, involving Rufus, when the cannon is fired, the top of Shinra Towers, where Rufus was hiding, gets destroyed, leaving people to assume that Rufus died. This allows Heidegger and Scarlet to take control of Shinra, where they fight Cloud and company in a giant mech, which I'm sure this fight's going to be absolutely amazing in the third remake game. And this is where Rufus' story pretty much ends in the original game, with him getting blasted away in the tower. Now, as we know, Rufus does live on, and we see him in the movie Advent Children, but he's looking a little worse for wear here, which raises the question, how did he survive and what exactly happened to him? Well, we find out on our way to a small episode Shinra, an accompanying book to the Final Fantasy VII series, which is written by one of the main story and scenario writers for the original and the remake games. So I'm like 99% sure these books and the events in them are considered canon. You can fact check me on that, but given that a lot of characters and some elements exclusive to those are showing up in the remake games, I think it's pretty safe to say and assume that anything that happened in those is more or less considered canon or can be retconned and tweaked a little bit and brought in. Now, in episode Shinra, we learn Rufus went down an escape hatch in the president's office, aka the loser tunnel. This tunnel drops Rufus off in the loser room, which is locked and has a bunch of loser pills in it to help him recover from his loser wounds. Wait. Why the hell does Shinra have a loser tunnel leading to a loser room in the president's office? Well, we learn as a child, Rufus was getting a tour of his father's office, and young Rufus wonders what the escape plan is in case someone was to attack the office. The president at the time laughs in Rufus's face because he believed that nobody could ever attack him in his office, and he informed young Rufus that if someone was to encounter him and confront him in his office, he's not going to run from it. Being the loving father that was, he decided that he would build a hatch for Rufus because he knew Rufus might want to use it, and he marked the button to that escape hatch and the medical supplies within the bunker with the letter L for loser, as a jab at Rufus for being a loser and having to run away. You see, Rufus is very prideful, and he does not take well to being looked down on. But despite his father's jabs, of the three sons that the president of Shinra had, Lazard being the oldest, Rufus the middle child, and Evan the youngest, Rufus is the only child that the president of Shinra truly acknowledged, and he raised Rufus, more so bred him, to become his replacement as president of Shinra one day. Now, due to this goal of his father, Rufus had a very strict upbringing, probably bordering abuse at times, and Rufus's entitlement and ambition became so large that in his early life, Rufus actually worked on plots to kill his father multiple times to take his position as president much sooner than intended. Now, while most of these plots ended up failing, one of these did lead to Rufus creating the anti-Shinra terrorist organization known as Avalanche. These plans and schemes of Rufus in his younger years we see mostly take place in an older cell phone game called Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII. I won't get into all the events of this game, but for Rufus it ends up with two main things happening to him. One is that he gains control and loyalty of the few remaining Turks, and two, the organization Avalanche that Rufus created ends up betraying Rufus. Avalanche is left in tatters, but control of it was taken from Rufus, and it is now controlled by two new characters that I feel will play a much more important role in the third remake game. I think a lot of events involving Avalanche and Rufus losing control of it will manifest in Wu Tai in the remake games, and they're going to use the newcomer Glenn as a bridge to connect these events into the new game. But before we start taking crazy conspiracy theory pills and going off the rails and talking about what could be, let's wrap up this Rufus history lesson real quick. That's right, we aren't done yet. There's just a wee bit more to get through. So now let's jump back to when Rufus actually hits that loser button in the president's office. He fell through a giant rib-breaking air shaft ride that dumps him into the locked loser room. Now in this locked loser room, there is a keypad, and Rufus cannot solve the password on this key panel. Oh, and just to mention it, he is stuck in this room while Sephiroth's meteor is crashing to Earth. He's essentially at ground zero for the meteor. Now, as you can imagine, if you're locked in a plain medical room that you can't escape, you might end up just reflecting on the actions of your life and what led you up to this point, which Rufus actually does while numbing the pain of his wounds with the loser pills that his dear old dad left behind for him. Now, eventually Rufus does solve this puzzle of the keypad and realizes the password to the room is his birthday. If you recall from the start of this video, I did say that they strangely have changed the date of Rufus's birthday in the remakes to a much more very interesting date, but we will get to that later on. Now, once Rufus escapes this room in the original continuity, he passes out and is saved by his loyal Turks, Reno and Rude. There's a bunch of other events that take place involving Rufus, but I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit as the Turks end up taking him to Calm so he can recover. Here, Rufus does send the Turks out on numerous missions to gather information, try to find new allies, all that good stuff. But one time when the Turks are on a mission, Rufus is kidnapped by folks that still hate him as well as Shinra. This leads to him being held captive in a cave by someone someone who is treating people with a strange, new, unknown disease, and this person thinks that Rufus has the resources to help him cure this disease. Now, Rufus is held in imprisonment here for multiple years, and eventually at one point a flood does occur and Rufus is submerged in this black water. This black water is actually the source of the disease, and this disease is called geostigma. The doctor knows the black water is what's causing this disease, as the black water seems to have cells of Sephiroth and Jenova within it, and the doctor tells Rufus that if he can bring him Jenova, her body could potentially lead to a cure of this disease, which is now spreading. Now again, these events aren't being made up by me, these are covered in the book On a Way to a Smile, episode Shinra. And those in the know are aware that geostigma is one of the core plots of the movie Advent Children, where Rufus is shown to be sick and is secretly hiding the head of Jenova, which is taken by Kadaj and used to resurrect Sephiroth near the end. Now Cloud of course does defeat Sephiroth once again, and Aerith from the Lifestream uses her healing rain to cleanse the world of this geostigma disease. This leads into the events of Dirge of Service, where Rufus is secretly bankrolling the World Regenesis organization in an effort to protect the world, as he feels like he has a debt to the planet. I know that was a bit of a long history lesson, but since a lot of Rufus's history happens outside of the original game, I just wanted to cover it. Again, commentators, let me know where I'm off, any little details that you think are important I might have missed, but I will let you know I did bury the lead on some of these details to talk about them later on. So now let's take this historical context of Rufus and look into directions where I think he might go story-wise. Because as we've seen in the remakes, they're giving this handsome man in his bridal gown way more screen time than they did in the original story. The first main thing that the remake games have done is introduced a new conflict, a war with the nation of Wu Tai, and they have brought in Glenn from the new mobile game, which while I hate what that game is, I do find some of the story elements in it kind of interesting. So what we know from this game and Rebirth is that Glenn feels betrayed by Shinra and Rufus, which, hey, get in line, bud. Glenn seems to be someone that Rufus might fear, as we know Jenova uses people you love, fear, and hate as a way to manipulate you. Now, unlike Cloud, Rufus at the end of Rebirth is wise enough to see through these manipulations, and he realizes that the war on Wu Tai is here to distract him from his goal of reaching the Promised Land. Now, I personally believe that even though Rufus knows this is all a ruse, it is far too late to pull out of this war with Wu Tai, and honestly, I think deep down Rufus probably wants this war anyways, and he'll try to conquer Wu Tai quick, fast, and in a hurry, as his goal is to reach the Promised Land, which he believes right now is at Northern Crater. At least that's what the original has told us. The remakes haven't told us that piece yet. I do think though, through some avenue or some other way, that Wu Tai, be it a map adjustment or some other means, Wu Tai is going to basically be preventing us, Cloud and company, not just Rufus, from reaching Northern Crater. Will people whine and say these new events in Wu Tai are filler and fluff? 100%, even if it ends up being pretty well written and done. Now, Wu Tai in the original game is an optional area. I think some of the events that do happen in the original can still happen in the remakes, things like Don Corneo capturing Elena and Yuffie, as well as Yuffie confronting her dad, who originally was one of the leaders in Wu Tai. These events can still occur with this war event taking place. One key thing here about the Wu Tai events in the original were we actually worked with the Turks briefly in helping Elena and Yuffie from the Dawn, and if Wu Tai is going to function as a barrier to the Northern Crater for everyone, I can kind of see a world where we end up working with the Turks and to an extent working with Rufus in order to reach Northern Crater. I strongly believe these new Wu Tai events will use Glenn and Yuffie to bridge the gap and tie in the events both old and new from the mobile games and the remake DLC mission Intergrade. This will flesh out Rufus's original Avalanche plotline to kill his father, the failure of it, the fallout caused by this plot, and the betrayal of Avalanche to Rufus. Rufus will be guided by anger and want revenge against the folks who took Avalanche away from him, and will likely be trying to show them what their place is in the world beneath him. Now, I believe Glenn and Yuffie's father will probably be working with the characters that stole Avalanche away from Rufus in the first place, and these two characters are Verdot and Elfe. And I know, who the hell are Verdot and Elfe? Verdot, sometimes called Veld, was one of the original leaders of the Turks, more or less the guy Sung muddled himself after, and Verdot plays some roles in the old mobile game and the Dirge of Cerberus game. He also could be the reason that in Intergrade, Scarlet comments that Wu Tai seems to be well informed these days. Since Veld was once the leader of the Turks, he would have an amazing skill set at gathering information. Now, Elfe. Elfe is a bit more special and in my opinion, way more interesting and way more cool of a character, and quite frankly, I want to not just really see her in the remake, I would love to be able to play her in some way, shape, or form, even if it is just a VR mission. I know that's pretty high hopes, but Elfe is Verdot's daughter, and like many others, she was experimented on by Hojo. Now, Elfe is a bit of a badass. She uses an unnamed katana and also has materia embedded into her arm. And I'm gonna guarantee she probably is gonna show up in this new mobile game at some point, assuming she hasn't. I know the new chapter comes out soonish while I'm recording this. Now, Veld and Elfe are essentially the characters that stole Avalanche away from Rufus, and their fate has never been shown in any content that I'm aware of or can find. This leaves us with a very big unanswered question of what exactly happened to these two. And guess what? The devs have said they want to use the remakes as a way to answer unanswered questions, so this seems like right pickings to me. Basically, in simple terms, I think the Wu Tai War will ultimately be the event that brings in all the mobile games, old and new, and all the new plot points from the Yuffie DLC into the continuity. Could it involve Deep Ground, which we saw from the Yuffie DLC, but I think those elements, like those around Sonon, you might see later on in the game when we confront Hojo, but I'll talk about that briefly later on. Now, this is a Rufus video, and I am straying from that topic a little bit, but I do want to talk about Yuffie here for a second. Have a intergrade, if you will. Now, I will admit, this part here, a little bit of a stretch, but you've listened to me for a while now, but I think you deserve something a little crazy that you can chew on and call me a complete loon over. So let's go over to the conspiracy board for a second. Elfe has materia in her hand due to Hojo that gives her great power, enough to challenge people like Sephiroth, but it drains her life force when she uses it. She also wears green, has a brown cloak. So now let's take a look at Yuffie. Yuffie uses an arm guard that has a materia slot in the arm. Yuffie's also known to wear green, and now she has on a brown cloak when she dresses in her Mongol assassin attire. I would argue that Yuffie's look is not too dissimilar to what Elfe wears. Now, Yuffie is young, and young people are impressionable. Most kids will imitate people they look up to. Is it possible that Elfe is an idol that Yuffie models herself after, that Yuffie looks up to, and Yuffie wants to become as strong as? Oh, and let's talk about the fact that Yuffie is obsessed with stealing materia. But do we ever really learn why she's so obsessed with stealing materia? She says it's to make her nation strong and to return it to what it once was. But is that the real reason? Just because of the power it gives? Yuffie's annoying, sure, but she does not truly seem like the power-hungry type. Could it be that Yuffie knows Elfie's life force is fading and Elfe needs materia in order to restore herself? Could it be that the greater reason Yuffie is always searching for stronger materia is to save the life of someone she looks up to try to save the life of her hero? I feel like if this was the case, that it would really add a stronger layer to Yuffie's character. Could even see Elfe becoming drained during some type of conflict, maybe saving Cloud and Groot somehow, which leads to her death, where Elfe would then go into the Lifestream. Maybe once Elfe is in the Lifestream, she might meet a familiar face there, which this kind of leads into my theory about how I think Knights of the Round will work in the future, but we'll put the pots and pans away for now. And I know this is a little bit of a stretch, but with Avalanche and Wu Tai, I don't think Elfe being involved is too far away from the field of possibility. Feel free to tell me how off base I am with this. For now, let's get back to Rufus. So I can see a situation where we beat the Wu Tai piece, but Rufus doesn't want to just get through Wu Tai. He wants to completely wipe them off the map. I can see this altercation kind of leading to the one-on-one duel that Cloud and Rufus seem to have in each of the remake games. And as Cloud, we would most likely beat Rufus, which would cause him to retreat. But at this point, it wouldn't really matter if Rufus retreated, as Rufus's goal is to get to Northern Crater, and he wants to end the threats of his former Avalanche members who have turned against him, Glenn, Veld, and Elfe. And if we've wiped them out and destroyed them in the process of going through Wu Tai, then for Rufus, it's mission accomplished. And now Rufus can once again focus on the Promised Land and Sephiroth. Now, I'm sure once everyone gets to Northern Crater in the remakes, I'm sure Rufus will again be disappointed that the Promised Land isn't here, and Cloud will again give the Black Materia to Sephiroth, Meteor will be summoned, and the weapons will appear just like the original game. Now, Rufus is still going to end up capturing Tifa, Barrett, and Kate probably, and try to kill them in Junon, leading to similar events with Sapphire Weapon showing up. And once Sapphire Weapon shows up in the chaos, they'll all escape, and Rufus will again flee, taking the Mako Cannon to Midgar and consulting his board about what to do next when it comes to Meteor, the weapons, and Sephiroth. Now, when it comes to this section of the game and the Mako Cannon in Midgar, I think this is where we're going to see a lot of expansion again. I think Hojo hijacking the cannon is going to play a much bigger role in the overall plot, and probably mostly tie in a lot of Vincent's character events, as long as some of the story events from Dirge of Cerberus. I think when Hojo hijacks this cannon, we're going to see more Deep Ground members come to protect him than we did in the original, which would loop in a lot of the Deep deep ground events we saw with Yuffie. Here we will probably see Hojo use the Omega Materia from Vincent's game Dirge of Cerberus to power up the cannon, not just with Mako, and then use that to blast Sephiroth and Jenova, increasing them with, again, not just the power of Mako, but also the power of the Omega Materia as well. Now, I'm sure when the cannon's fired, just like the original, Shinra HQ is going to take a huge hit of damage, and Rufus is going to have to, again, retreat to this loser room, possibly being knocked out and having a near-death experience while he's in this room. Here, he might dip a little toe into the Lifestream, like I mentioned with Elfe. Rufus may also meet a familiar face, and again, this kind of ties into my theory of how Knights of the Round might work and be changed a little bit. I think exposure to the Lifestream, or the dream world, or whatever we want to call this, will sort of work as Rufus's awakening or his come to God moment, where he reflects on his past and sees what damage his ambition and drive have caused, with Zack guiding him, letting him know that his past actions don't have to define him. No matter how dark they might be, he can change and the future can be better for it, which deep down, that is kind of what Rufus wants. He wants a good future for the people of Midgar. I think here, looking through Rufus's past is also where we might get some new and shocking revelations about the character of Rufus and his very clouded past. So, in episode Shinra, they talk about how Rufus leaves the loser room by entering his birthday into the keypad, and as mentioned in the remakes, they have changed Rufus's birthday to a new date. This does make Rufus about 5 years older, which kind of makes him just make more sense as a character. But why do I keep saying this new date is important? Because of this change of birth date, Rufus is now born the same year that the Jenova project was approved, and the same year that Soldier Project Zero was approved. So the goal of these projects was to not just create super soldiers, but there was an additional goal with these projects, as they wanted to create a human Cetra hybrid. Now, Project Zero was the precursor to the soldier program as we know it. Project Zero is what we see Glenn and company were a part of. In Project Zero, they powered up the best members they had in the security Shinra force with Mako. This enhanced them, making them stronger, turning them into super soldier lights. But these candidates did not receive any Cetra or Jenova cells at all, at least as far as we know. Now, later on, when Jenova was discovered and falsely labeled as a Citra, Jenova cells were used in Project G and Project S, and these led to the creation of Sephiroth, Genesis, and Angeal, Sephiroth being considered the first perfect Cetra human hybrid. So even though there were earlier soldier projects that existed, Sephiroth was considered the first true soldier, as the soldiers from Project Zero were now considered obsolete, and going forward, these Jenova enhanced candidates would be called soldiers. Now, as we know, Jenova is not actually a Cetra, but let's put some of that Jenova stuff aside for a second. Now, I do think there is a very small chance Rufus could be retconned and given a small amount of Jenova cells. I don't think that's going to be the case. Hell, they almost teased it a little bit with Cloud telling him, "You'll never be a soldier." But I think this line can have multiple different meanings, since soldier seems to have multiple different meanings. Sure, Rufus does have enhanced physical prowess, but he was trained by the Turks, and the Turks have also fought with Cloud and held their own. We also don't see Rufus suffer from degradation at all. The main reason I also feel Rufus won't have Jenova cells is something a little different. As I mentioned, Jenova and Sephiroth have had to use black-robed manifestations to come to Rufus in order to manipulate him. Rufus had Jenova cells. I feel like they could have done the more direct approach, like they do with Cloud, where they just apparate thoughts and visions directly into Rufus's head. Rufus also isn't driven and doesn't seem to care about the reunion at all. Sure, he wants to go to Northern Crater, but he wants to go there because he thinks the Promised Land is there, and once he finds out the Promised Land isn't Northern Crater, he kind of just wants to leave. He doesn't care about being part of the reunion. But I get it. So where exactly am I going with all of this? Well, there are a few interesting things I think we see happening here with Mr. Bridal Design Rufus. One is Rufus can see whispers. Now, other folks can see these too, usually those important to the plot, like Cloud and company. Cisne even mentions being able to see them in Rebirth, specifically the Black Whispers. And Red 13 tells us in Remake, whispers are drawn to those who attempt to alter Destiny's course and ensure they do not. But I think Rufus seeing the whispers is a little more important than just him having contact with Cloud, because Reno and Rude seem to not see the whispers, and they've been in contact with Cloud, so I think there's a bigger reason why he's seeing the whispers. But moving forward, when Rufus was younger and had that conversation with his father about the president office not having an escape route, which led to the creation of the loser button that I've mentioned, the way this is brought up, it almost sounds like Rufus had a premonition, which kind of odd. He's seeing into the future. Rufus also has a very strange obsession with the Promised Land. Sure, his father was interested in it too, and it is kind of overall a mission statement of Shinra to build Neo Midgar. But Rufus is way more interested in the idea and the lore of the ancients. Rufus also doesn't say he wants to build a promised land, he alludes to the idea that he wants to discover it and he wants to drag humanity towards it, aggressively guide humanity to the promised land. Now Aerith is the last living half Citra. She seems to have almost always seen the Whispers, and she's been known to have premonitions at times where she can kind of peek into the future a little bit. And Aerith also is kind of interested in finding the promised land. Now, am I saying that Rufus is another living Citra, possibly being Aerith's half-brother? No. There's a small chance that this could happen, but I don't think that's the case. I feel Hojo probably would have done something to Rufus. That's if Hojo was aware of this fact. But what I do think is that Soldier Project Zero may have done more than just showering a couple employees of the month with Mako energy. Here comes the stretch. I think Professor Gast, the scientist who is obsessed with the Citra, may have had either A, some previous but much smaller and complete Citra cells in hand, or B, may have had access to Umphalna at an earlier point in time, which I know would have to change the timeline and retcon a few things, but hey, they've already retconned Rufus's birth, and for those of you who don't know or remember, Umphalna is Aerith's mother, and this Professor Gast guy, well, he's actually Aerith's father, her real dad, not some weird turkey baster type stuff we got going on with Sephiroth and the other Project boys. Now I lean more towards A, that Gast had access to an incomplete sample of Cetra cells, because as we know, Gast has incorrectly ID'd Jenova as a Cetra. If the Cetra samples we had were incomplete, this could lead to him falsely identifying Jenova as a Cetra. Or is it possible that Jenova maybe just influenced Gast into having him think and believe that Jenova was in fact a Cetra? Maybe. Jenova is known to be a crafty gal. As mentioned, for Project Zero, one of the goals was to always create a human Cetra hybrid. My thought here is maybe Professor Gast ended up running a test under the secret guidance from President Shinra, tried to create a hybrid using this incomplete Cetra DNA, either from an unknown Cetra or possibly having Umphalna's DNA. But again, if it was to be Umphalna's DNA, this would require some changing of the timelines, which is why I kind of don't necessarily think that's what it is, but it could be. But either way, using this Cetra DNA and using the president of Shinra's DNA, he could complete the sequence and make a half-human, half-Citra hybrid, and that would be little baby Rufus. Now, our Rufus may have been smart and healthy. He doesn't seemingly show anything special, not like Sephiroth did. And maybe since the Cetra DNA was incomplete and added artificially, it ended up with him basically being a great value Cetra that doesn't pass a 23andMe test. So like Project Zero as a whole, Rufus as a half Cetra, half human hybrid would ultimately be deemed as a failure, which would hurt Rufus's ego, sure, but this could also maybe lead to the reason why Daddy President always liked to remind Rufus how much of a failure he was. I hear you. Eggplant, that DNA turkey basting stuff, that sounds exactly like what Professor Hojo and Hollander did with Project S and G to create Sephiroth, Genesis, and Angeal, only they used Jenova's DNA. And yeah, Professor Gast was the senior scientist to Hojo and Hollander. Maybe this is where they got the idea from in the first place, and since Project Zero and Rufus ended up being a failure, not appearing to be anything special whatsoever, just a normal human being, maybe with this new Cetra, Jenova, that they had access to, who had full complete DNA, the power-hungry Hojo saw this as his chance to one-up his old teacher. Now we find in the original, through the events at Icicle Inn, that Gast eventually did realize Jenova was not a Cetra and saw what Hojo was up to, and he left. He ran. This does lead to Professor Gast going into the Icicle Inn, finding Umphalna, and ultimately the birth of Aerith. Once Hojo does find where Gast is hiding though, this ends up with Aerith and Umphalna being captured by Hojo and Professor Gast being killed by Hojo, which Hojo of course covers up. Does seem like they might be inserting Sid into the picture here at some point too, but we'll see how that goes down. Now while Rufus might have been deemed a failure, Rufus is still smart and capable, which is why the president kept young Rufus around and did not discard Rufus like his older or younger brothers, both who also have different unknown mothers. Rufus, however, may still have some of those Cetra traits similar to Aerith, just to a much lesser extent. Rufus may not be able to commune with the planet or the Lifestream like Aerith can, at least not that we know of or have seen yet, but Rufus did seemingly have a future premonition as a child leading to the creation of the loser button in the president's office. Maybe Rufus seeing the Whispers is just part of the Cetra influence on him and not because he's part of the destined ones. Rufus also seems to have a much higher perception than other characters in the series, which is why he was able to see through Jenova's ruse when Jenova and Sephiroth were coming to him in the form of Glenn. But I think the main trait that we see Rufus have that he shares with the Cetra is that he's obsessed with the Promised Land and trying to lead people to it. Could it be because of his upbringing? He was taught and this was instilled on him? Sure, but the drive that he has to find the promised land feels almost more instinctual. Also, Rufus has a dog, Darkstar. Red 13 clearly has some connections to Aerith due to their shared experiences under Hojo, sure, but it also seems to be because they're both ancient races. Red's race, as far as I know, isn't really named or overly fleshed out in any meaningful way beyond that they are Watchers of the Veil. Red 13 also has an instinctual calling, it seems, to try to protect Aerith, and he will even die protecting her, as we saw in Zack's alternative timeline, memory, reality thing. My guess is that Red 13's race probably helped guard and protect the Cetra from enemies. I mean, his lineage does watch over the Cave of the Gi for the Cetra. So yeah, while Darkstar may not have the same intelligence that Red 13 has, he, like Rufus, may be a imperfect hybrid and may have some of the traits that Red's race does, those traits being that they will guard a Citra until death. And even though Rufus and Darkstar are both imperfect hybrids, so this instinct to protect Rufus may be a lot deeper than training and may also be a little bit inherited. So again, when Rufus is locked up in this loser room, Rufus will go into the Lifestream purgatory, alt reality, timeline, whatever it is briefly. Rufus here will discover the truth around his birth while being driven to become a good person by Zack and possibly Aerith. And since the Lifestream works in odd ways, Rufus could see visions of his future around Geostigma, how he builds Edge City for the people, how events of Advent Children and the Geostigma crisis play out, and how in Dirge of Cerberus he starts trying to use his resources to repay his debt to the planet. This might even be a weird way to tie in some of those events into the final game. Seeing all these expanded events, past, present, and future, can be used to further the story to tell why Rufus had a sudden change of character and heart after the events of Meteor. Now, Rufus may wake up before the final battle, wondering if all these events were real or not. He could even try to use his original birthday on the keypad for the loser room and keep failing, but then when he uses his newly discovered birthday that shows he was part of Project Zero, this could unlock the door for him, proving that that wasn't just a crazy lucid dream, it was all very much real. So why would it even be important that Rufus learns this truth about who he is and finding out that he could be a good person? Well, again, this kind of leads into my theory of how I think Knights of the Round will work, and it won't just be random Cetra Knights that are the Knights of the Round. Instead, this summoning materia will be memories of important heroes throughout all of Final Fantasy VII, past, present, and future, and Zack more or less rallies these memories and people in the Lifestream so that they can be summoned and called upon by Cloud in a hope to save the planet in combination with Holy. Now, Rufus may not be a hero to the planet at this point in time, but one in the future, and since the planet may have a memory of this future, Rufus may be an unlikely hero that joins these Knights of the Round. Honestly, my next theory video is probably going to jump into this theory of the Knights of the Round a bit more. I've named this theory already, I just don't want to spoil the name of it yet. But yeah, that does kind of sum up what I think is going to happen with Rufus. I think we're going to see more events from his past, tie in all those Avalanche events. It's going to make him a much more interesting, fleshed out character, as opposed to just being the big bad guy leader of Shinra. I think it's going to allude to the fact that Rufus can and could be a hero, and Zack in the Lifestream might be the one who kind of guides and pushes him towards becoming that hero, which would lead him to becoming a Knight of the Round or a Defender of the Planet. If you stuck around this long, thank you. Comment below, poke holes in this theory, hit the winning buttons if you want. Anyways, as always, drive fast, take chances. Later, nerds.
Oh, Biggs, buddy.